So when we're talking about mixed media, there are a lot of different options for us as far as surfaces to work on, right? And I'd like to show you kind of the range that is out there and available. And I'm just going to I'm going to kind of cycle through these, hopefully in some kind of logical order. And perhaps we will discuss something that you are not familiar with and that might work well for whatever you are working with. Okay, so first let's talk about papers. Paper is nice because it's cheap, right? And that is an important part of deciding what surface to work on, right? Expense, that has a lot to do with it. Not only because you have, you want to be conscious of your finances, but also because when you get an expensive canvas, you tend to treat it differently than you do a less expensive surface. You tend to get more uptight. You tend to be precious with it. You tend to be more anxious. You tend to not take the risks and chances that you need to get the result that you want, right? So sometimes a cheaper surface is better psychologically, right? A better surface to work on psychologically. So I don't think it should be underestimated the importance of paper. This is called Canva paper. It is my wife teaches kids art lessons, and apparently she has been using my Canva paper. It is actually paper that has a texture of canvas stamped onto it, and one side is prepared with gesso, right? The back side, that's smooth, it's not completely smooth, but smoother than the front side, does not have gesso, so you got to be careful which side you're working on. You want to work on the side that's been prepped, okay? Canva pad.
Canva, can you spell it?
C-A-N-V-A, Canva pad. And there are a bunch of different brands. The point is, though, that it is paper, it is not canvas. There are sheets or tablets that look very similar to this that are canvas, that aren't paper. And I'll talk about those in just a second, okay? Canva paper, it's inexpensive compared to other materials. I'm going to pass these around. Please make sure they get back to me eventually. Next is watercolor block. This is watercolor paper that comes on a rigid support, cardboard on the back. It comes in cold press and hot press. Cold press, remember, is rough. Hot press is smooth. And it's called a block because it actually has adhesive on all four sides of that block, except for a little sliver right there where there's no adhesive, and that's where you slip in your palette knife and run it around the edge so you can get it off the block, right? So why that is nice is it keeps the paper flat, right, while you're working on it. Obviously, it doesn't have the advantage of like a sketchbook where you can flip the pages and work on the sheets behind it, but it does keep the surface nice and flat so it doesn't buckle quite as much as a piece of paper would that isn't adhered to a hard or a rigid support. Any questions about that?
Yeah, cost compared to the other.
Cost compared, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't have a list of costs.
On that particular size, it's not so bad. The larger sizes can be $45 and $60
Right.
for the 16 by.
I'm guessing this is probably in the neighborhood of like 15 to 20, 12 to 20, something like that.
Well, I just paid 18.
You just paid 18. Okay.
But you get how many pieces?
This is 20 sheets, right? And it comes in a lot of different sizes. I'm going to, all right. Okay, so watercolor block, a great option. I'm going to pass that around. Next, what's that? Correct, or even not a lot of water. The paper will buckle no matter what. So it actually is it's a good solution for a lot of applications. Next is illustration board. So this brand is Crescent. Crescent, C-R-E-S-C-E-N-T, is a fairly, it's everywhere. It's a fairly common brand. Illustration board, it comes in various thicknesses. It's inexpensive. A full, I think 11 by 17, something like that sheet costs a couple bucks maybe. The thicker stuff can cost $3 or $4, but the cheap stuff is usually adequate for most applications, right? This is not prepared. It is not ready for aqueous media, so you would have to treat the surface with either matte medium to seal it or gesso. When you do that, it tends to start warping. You can kind of fight that warpage by painting a big X on the back of the illustration board, and that kind of warps it the other way. So it kind of counteracts the warping. But it's, yes. So that is illustration board. Again, it's a little bit more rigid than your watercolor papers or or the Canva paper, and it's fairly inexpensive. So I will pass that around. That's illustration board. Next is in here. I got a lot of stuff. Some of these things I didn't have any examples of except for stuff that I've worked on. So this is, I forgot, I think it's like Reeves. It's a thick paper, a printmaking paper, right? You guys are familiar with printmaking, right? Like etching or any kind of intaglio process, right? They use monoprint. They use a thicker kind of paper. It usually has higher cotton content, right? Called rag content, which makes it more archival and a little bit more durable, stuff like that. Anyway, it's nicer to work with than like a thin drawing paper or something like that. It's a little bit more durable, it's archival, and it's formulated specifically to take a little bit more abuse, right, than normal types of paper. So it's really thick. This is called BFK Reeves. I think there are several different types. You can go, usually they're in the flat files at Blick or whatever art store. They have those big cabinets with lots of flat files. This, like the watercolor block and like the illustration board, is not sealed, right? It's just raw paper. So depending on what you're doing, you might want to also prepare it with either matte medium or gesso to seal the surface and make it ready for aqueous media, acrylic, oil, whatever, collage. So this I've actually does have. You can see the difference in color between the margins on this and the back, right? This I've gessoed. So feel it, and you can get a kind of a feel for the consistency. The nice thing about this type of paper, too, is because it is, it reacts well to getting wet. Like the illustration board warps a lot. These papers don't tend to warp as much because in printmaking you soak it in water. Right? The paper is actually meant to receive water a little bit. So it's actually it's a really nice surface, and again less expensive.
Would Rabbit glue work as well as gesso or
you can use hide glues, but I would say that you're better off using a PVA size or matte medium. The rabbit skin glue doesn't really buy you much. And it does have some distinct disadvantages, like it smells. It's stinky. It smells like rabbits. Yeah.
rabbits don't stink when they're dead. Okay, point made.
Yes. I would not buy a cologne of rabbit smell, per se. No, but PVA size is, it obviously doesn't have the organic things that rabbit skin glue has in it, and it's also, when it dries, whereas rabbit skin glue can re-wet and
That's what I was asking.
yeah. But yeah, you could use rabbit skin glue if you want to. Okay, so that's printmaking papers. There's a lot of different varieties. A full sheet 22 by 30 is the usual dimensions on these printmaking papers. They will cost anywhere from $3 to $10, somewhere, depending on the quality of the paper, the thickness, the rag content, stuff like that. Finally, in terms of paper, are you guys with me so far? I'm kind of, it's gotten really tedious yet. I could talk about this stuff forever. Finally, this is a piece of bond paper, just like Xerox paper. Don't underestimate the power of bond. No, I just wanted to bring this up as simply again the point that sometimes the least expensive option is the best one, right? And it's not necessary. What's that? Oh well. I don't know. That's okay. Don't worry about it. Yeah, that's okay. That's all right. Thank you. It could be that you don't get any visual. I don't know. We'll see. Hopefully, this is going to work out. All right. So bond paper. Sometimes the cheapest is the best. I've done lots of series where I just made a Xerox of an image, and I painted on top of the image, and I sanded it, and but I would make like 20 copies of the same image. And what it helps me do is kind of like rapid prototyping, right? Like it just helps me get ideas out, gives me an image to immediately respond to. I'm not worried about destroying it because I got 15 more and I can make 20 more if I wanted to, right? So there's a certain kind of, again, psychological freedom that comes from working with these kind of more cheap, immediately accessible materials. So don't underestimate the importance of these kind of more readily accessible and cheap materials. Let's move on to next.
Is that in your home computer?
Yes, I think, yeah, I just printed that out on.
You can, that paper will print out.
Yeah, it's just bond paper. It looks a little bit rough right now because I took some sandpaper to it. Yeah. Right now, I wouldn't put that in my computer anymore. It's got paint on it. Yes, but it's just regular computer bond paper. Okay, next, let's talk a little bit about canvas. This looks very similar to the Canva pad I showed you earlier, right? But the difference is very important. This is actually canvas, so it's fabric, right? It is not stamped with a texture because it actually has a texture, right? It is not faux canvas, it's fabric, right? Something important to mention here is that one side, and I'll pass this around so you can see, one side has gesso, one side does not. I've seen it many times happen where people will start painting on the wrong side, and there's a lot of reasons that you don't want to do that. Okay.
Can you tell the difference?
You can. I'll pass this around, but one side has a little bit less texture because the gesso will actually take away some of the texture. It's just got a different quality. You can see the paint on it. One side looks like just raw fabric. I'll pass this around though, so you can look at that. Again, this is canvas pad. Instead of Canva pad, it's canvas pad. You guys get one's paper, one's not. What's that?
Comes already gesso.
It comes already gessoed like Canva paper or Canva pad, like the paper. This also comes ready to go, right? So it's more expensive than the paper. It's more expensive than Canva pad, but it's also more durable. It acts more like canvas. It doesn't warp. The Canva paper still does warp, and it's not very good for oil paint because it does kind of absorb paint. So a good material. It's cheap. It's approachable. It's ready to go. It's easy to transport, etc., etc. Yeah, Canva pad. This is. I don't really want to show this painting, but it's the example I had. It's not me. It's a nephew.
It's a nephew?
I've started. I need money, right? So I've been doing these portraits for my brother. This is my nephew, and well, it's not such a bad painting, but it's not finished yet, and there's some kind of clumpy parts that I'm not especially proud of.
Yeah.
I don't like this kind of painting. I didn't want to do it. I resisted for years. Anyway, but the point is, it's just kind of uptight. It's kind of anal painting. I just don't care much for it. Anyway, this is a painting I did. I will accept that. Thank you. But what I wanted to show you here is this is actually linen. It's a fine grain linen, a portrait linen, that I have glued down to a board. Right? It's cedar plywood that's been cradled. Just cradled means that it has a frame on it, right? So I used matte medium. You can also use PVA size or rabbit skin glue if you so wish, to adhere the canvas to a board. You can also do this with cotton canvases as well. The reason I do this instead of using stretcher bars is because linen especially doesn't behave very well. It doesn't stretch evenly like cotton does. Cotton, when you gesso it, it'll shrink evenly. Linen will shrink more in one area than another, so it'll start to twist your stretcher bars. Then you have to re-stretch it. It's just kind of a pain. So I avoid all that by just gluing it to a rigid support so it doesn't move, right? I also prefer painting on a solid surface. So that's a good way to go. I will show you.
Excuse me, none of the samples are coming over here. I don't know where they're. Yes, it's not solid.
I don't know where they're going either. Connie? Connie? Could you do me a favor and see where the samples are getting stopped?
Somewhere over here. So this is the first one we've got.
Okay. All right. I guess I'll talk a little bit about canvas. Canvas.
Go back to that a second. You glue the whole board?
Yes, so I'll get to that in just a second. So this is what this board looked like before I glued it down. This is actually a little bit thicker, right? You can buy it in different thicknesses. This is what the cradled panel looks like. It looks like 1/8 inch cedar or birch ply, I think. I can't remember. That's cradled. These things are fairly inexpensive at Artists and Craftsmen Supply. They have a Canadian manufacturer that allows them to sell them really cheap. If you go buy these things at Blick, they're super expensive, right? But at Artists and Craftsmen Supply, you can actually buy them with gesso already on them as well. But the untreated ones are actually fairly inexpensive, and they're a good way to go. Artists and Craftsmen Supply, I do have a map and address and phone number on the website, as long as I get around to putting a link to it on our class page. But it is a couple blocks north of the 10 on La Cienega.
And that is called
It's
cradled what?
It's cradled panel, like it's birch ply, cradled birch ply panel. Comes in all sizes, yeah. When it gets larger, they have to put more supports in it. Anything more than 2 feet, you typically have, additional supports on the back. Okay, so this is this with a thinner width that has been wrapped in linen. The reason I did portraits with linen, this is maybe a topic for another time, but just to answer your question, I use linen instead of cotton duck because linen is seen as a more precious material. So I can sell it for more. When you say oil on linen, it has kind of a mystique.
Expensive.
Yeah, and it is significantly more expensive, but not necessarily to account for the price hike you can get away with, right? So it's and it has a different kind of texture. If you look at the weave of linen, there's kind of imperfections, and it's thinner. Linen also, when you stretch linen, it's got a longer fiber. So so it's got a different kind of give. Cotton, when you push on it, it'll give in a very specific location, right? It'll poke in right where you push. With linen, because the fibers are long, it will give a little bit more broadly, right? So a lot of people like that because for that reason. So there's a lot of different reasons why you'd want to use linen. I use linen because I thought I could charge more, in all honesty. So I'll pass that around. I gessoed the linen, yes. So I glued it down. I glued the linen down with matte medium, and then I did 3 layers of gesso and sanded. Yeah.
Are you saying linen or cotton canvas? I mean,
Linen,
not just linen,
linen canvas.
linen canvas.
Yes. So linen is different than cotton canvas.
Right.
They're
When
two
you
different-
say I use linen or I use cotton, you mean canvas?
Canvas, correct? Yeah.
Thanks.
And you can buy linen canvas already prepped. You can buy it in rolls. You can buy it pre-stretched. You can buy it in any. I'll show you some examples in a little bit. And the same with cotton as well. So this is. I'll pass this around. This is cradled panel. You can also buy masonite cradled. I don't like masonite as much as I like birch, because masonite, which is a composite kind of wood material, right? You guys know what masonite is? I think masonite doesn't take damage as well. Like, it starts to get beat up in the corners, whereas birch ply, it seems like, is a little bit more durable. It doesn't get quite so beat up. And masonite, when it starts getting beat up in the corners, it'll bulge a little bit, it'll swell a little bit. It starts to look a little tacky, in my opinion. So I think I prefer the birch ply over masonite. But masonite is a legitimate supply too, and a lot of people use it. I just don't prefer it, so I will not be. Well, actually, I have some examples of masonite here. Okay, next. This is an unfortunate painting, so please disregard it. But again, it is the only example of this. It's just a bad painting. I've got plenty of those. This is also linen, and unfortunately, I should have used it for a better cause. But it has been glued to foam core. Foam core. And it's the foam core. It's not just your average foam core. It's a little bit more rigid than usual foam core. It's actually a very quality material or supply. I highly recommend it. This particular brand is especially good. So if you're interested, you should write the name down, and I will have this also available up online as soon as I get around to it. But a very good. The brand name is New Traditions. New Traditions. Okay, so this is a linen that's been adhered to foam core. I'll pass that around. This.
You didn't glue the linen, it came
Correct.
that way.
It came that way, and it's already primed, and it's wonderful to use. I highly recommend it. It's just really convenient. Obviously, it's not as thick as a stretched canvas, and it's really light, and it's a little bit less expensive. Online, you have to. Yeah, it's not. They don't have that particular material in most art stores. This is similar. It's linen that's been adhered to birch plywood. This particular brand I don't recommend. When I got these, I bought these online. The edges were a little bit frayed, and I don't know. It was a little bit less. The craftsmanship wasn't all that great. There are other brands available that wrap the canvas around the edge, which I think looks a little bit better, especially if you want to float the canvas in a frame or something like that. So, but the point is still the same, that this is linen that, similar to the foam core, has been glued down to birch ply and is available in a lot of different sizes and is fairly inexpensive. This particular brand came prepared with oil primer, which I like, and you don't want to do by yourself. It's very stinky stuff, and it takes a long time to dry. And if you're painting with oil paint, the oil primer is good. If you're doing acrylic like collage or anything, you don't want to get that. But they also make it with acrylic prime. Okay, so that's it for the canvas. Now just for the raw panel. Okay, let's talk about. This is masonite, 8-inch masonite. You can also get it in 1/4 inch. This, it's called a lot of different things, artboard, whatever, a lot of different brands. It's essentially just primed masonite. It's a great surface to work on, really nice. And the gessos they use are, they're really evenly applied, and they're less expensive than stretch canvases sometimes, depending on the brand. It's a nice material, and it's good for collage because it's a rigid support. You can also buy boards that are formulated to work with watercolor. They use a more porous gesso. So anyway, there's a lot of different types of masonite. You can also get it that unprepared, like just raw masonite, which you have to gesso and stuff yourself. This is the same thing, but with a little bit of wax on it. This is it was raw right there. So I'll pass these around. You can take a look at that. This looks like more than 1/4 inch. This looks like 1/2 inch masonite that's been prepared or gessoed. The nice thing about these is they have these little hanging things on the back. So you can just slip that onto a screw or a nail, and it lays right up next to the wall, and it's your presentation built right in. So a lot of convenience with that. And then finally with the panel, I guess I'll keep these going, this is just regular birch plywood. You can buy this at House of Hardwoods, which is an excellent place to find wood. You can also get this at Osh and most hardware stores. There's Anawalt Lumber on Pico and Sepulveda. They'll cut it for you with a small fee. And it's fairly inexpensive. It's great to work on. You just gesso it and sand it a little bit, and it's ready to go. This and masonite, you can buy a 4 by 8 foot sheet of this stuff for like $20 to $30, and get it cut down to more manageable sizes. And again, it's a good quality material to work with. It's a rigid support, and it tends to be fairly cheap when you buy it in bulk like that. Especially 2 or 3 of you go to the hardware or lumber yard together, and you get a big sheet cut down. It's actually a really good way to go to get a lot of surfaces to work on that are quality and good. So birch ply or masonite, you can also get masonite at most lumber yards. Then finally, what I wanted to show is, this is actually something I haven't gotten around to working on, but it is aluminum. And it's actually, it comes in big sheets, and you can print on it. So this is actually an image I got printed on the aluminum. A friend of mine owns a print shop, and he printed it out for me. So you could print images on aluminum. You could collage onto it. You could bend it and sculpt with it or cut it up. It's thin enough that with some metal cutters you could actually like cut it into strips or whatever. So metal, aluminum, it's a good material as well. You do have to know what you're doing when you start if you want to cradle it, if you want to put a frame on it. That gets a little bit tricky because if you cradle it with wood warps differently and deals with climate change differently than metal does, and so it's hard to get it to work nice. I'm hoping to get to make a video about working on aluminum sometime in the near future, but it's a little bit tricky. There are traditionally a lot of artists used to paint on copper sheets, on aluminum sheets. There's a tradition of using metal as a surface to paint on. I wouldn't recommend that unless there is a very specific reason for you to want to do that, because it is a little bit more involved and takes a little bit more know-how if you want your painting to last. So I would avoid metals unless you want to do the research necessary. Question?
What do you think of cardboard? I know a lot of people make lightweight collages.
Cardboard is, I feel fine about cardboard. It's not as archival, so it's going to yellow a little bit more. It won't take moisture quite as well as some of these other options, so it will warp a little bit more. When it gets wet, sometimes, depending on the quality of the cardboard, you'll start to see that corrugated paper in the middle. So it kind of depends. I think I personally would choose. I think there are other options that are preferable for different reasons. That are equally as inexpensive. I would take paper over cardboard, for instance, like a quality printmaking paper. When we're talking about collage, and we will eventually go over collage in more depth, I would suggest using a rigid support, like these birch plywoods, or there's a number of them that I talked about today. The reason is because if there's any flex in the material you're collaging onto, it's really hard not to get rippling in your collage element. And rippling isn't necessarily bad, but it is bad if it doesn't look intentional. And it's hard to get rippling to look intentional. So I would suggest that if you want to get into collage, if that's what you're here to do, you might want to think about working on rigid supports. It's not necessary. You can do it on paper, and I do it. I collage on paper all the time. I just want to throw that out at you. That one of the reasons I did this today is to give you some ideas. For those of you that are working with multimedia with a lot of different stuff, rigid supports are often the best answer because they take a little bit more abuse and they don't have that flex, that could cause problems and things sticking to the surface. I saw a hand back there.
Yeah, is the image on the aluminum fragile? Is it more fragile because of it being aluminum?
I don't believe so. What do you mean by fragile?
Like, well, with the paper or wood, it can kind of bond with the inherent material of the paper or wood.
I see. It's a non-porous material, right?
Exactly like that.
So, yeah. If you were using acrylic, because acrylic is plastic-based, it tends to not adhere as well as like oil. You might, be concerned with that a little bit, but I don't think so. They do prepare the surface with things to make the ink stick a little bit more, and there are also materials that you can coat it with that will allow things to stick a little bit better. The answer is yes and no. There are ways to prepare the surface to make it a little bit more adhesive friendly, but it is something that you need to worry about for sure.
Yeah, because to print on it, that sounds like it really opens up a huge door if it's not super fragile.
Yeah, no, it's not. Actually, it's formulated specific. They prepare the surface to receive inkjet, so it's made especially for that. And most shops will like lacquer it for you or something like that to put a surface on it. An acrylic lacquer. Question over here. Artist and Craftsman Supply is the name of the store. Okay, I believe that is it for the materials I've covered. Does anybody have any questions about what I've talked about, or have other materials that they are aware of that they would?